It's the third day of the Tata Steel 2021 Chess Tournament, an over-the-board classical slow game event being held in Vikonsee in the Netherlands. Today we have Magnus Carlsen versus the number 2 player in Norway, that is Arjan Tari, who also holds the title of handsomest Grandmaster in the world. And we have a couple of other matchups, and we're looking currently at a field where Niels Grandelius, the Swedish number 1, is in first place. So I've got 5 games for you. I'm going to look at 2 or 3 in detail to show you the winners, and I'm going to start off with a few appetizers. We'll kick things off in the game between Magnus Carlsen and Arjan Tari. Magnus with the white pieces goes for something we've seen him play many times, the 2 knights Queen's Gambit declined. Arjan Tari prepares something that's been very trendy recently. First he plays this, which is called the semi-tirage, and after Magnus takes on d5, rather than taking back with a knight here, Tari plays c takes d4. So 2 chops in the middle of the board, and now a flurry happens. So Magnus gets queen takes d4 on the board. We get e d5, e4, de4, trade the queen, knight to g5. So this creates 2 threats, and Tari volunteers his bishop for capture. And this leads to a position where, just for a very brief moment, Tari's up a pawn, but Magnus has the 2 bishops. Magnus quickly develops and castles queenside with a check, and Tari has to play king to e8, bishop b5, and rook c8. Which, you know, this position seems kind of insane to play against the guy who's literally known as probably the greatest endgame player of all time. You know, he will torture you to death, not actually, but on a chessboard. But Tari says, you know, man, you know, the more pieces I take away from you, like bishop to b4, take, you know, and then I put my, you know, king in the middle, the less pieces you have, the less of a chance you have to beat me. And so Magnus tries his very hardest. First, he kind of isolates this weakness on e6, doesn't let it move forward. Tari kicks his knight out, plays rook d8. They trade another pair of rooks. Magnus plays rook d1, rook c7, knight to e5. Magnus swarming with his 3 pieces. a6, bishop comes back. Bishop to b6, knight gives a check, and the bishop is now in prime position to do some damage. Tari here doesn't bite, calculates everything and plays knight c6. Leaves his king in the center of the board. Doesn't matter if Magnus can go and attack it, because after king f7, f5, offering Tari another pawn to take, which would have led to a position with knight h4 and knight takes f5, and would have left Tari, despite being a pawn up, in dire straits. He's got very big difficulty defending against both remaining pawns under attack. But Tari, cold-blooded, stares into this f5 move and plays king f6. And the point of king to f6 is, if you take this with the rook, I go king g5 and I trap your bishop on the edge of the board. Okay? So in the game we got fe6, king g5, and now the rook comes back. King goes back to f6, knight comes back, but Tari is just in time with his counterplay, bishop to e3, plants the bishop on g5, and now it's Magnus Carlsen who's got the passive knight, and Tari swarms in with the pieces. A short while later, Tari was able to trade off a set of pieces and bring his knight back, leading to a position where it's king rook and 2 versus king rook and 2. Some short while later, with some more, you know, advancement from Magnus, we get this position. Arjan Tari confident in his ability, even with his king stuck on the back rank. He's not going to lose king and 2 versus king and 2. And that's, you know, a valuable skill. You know, I know it's Magnus Carlsen versus Tari, 2 very strong players, but you have to understand when the position is a draw, how you can simplify it down into a drawn endgame, and the game ends with a stalemate. So, kind of a nice little appetizer for you. The second appetizer that I have for you is this game between Andrei Yesipenko, very strong Russian Grandmaster, and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, French number 1. First, we get a Sicilian, where we get queen takes d4. We get a position where white castles, black castles, and really, the most interesting part of this game happened in the middle game, when after bishop takes d5, Yesipenko played b4, and we get bishop takes f3, losing a queen, bishop takes e2, rook to d5. We have a position where one guy sacks his queen for 2 pieces, and then nothing happens. So MVL takes the rook, Yesipenko sacrifices the rook to kill off this bishop, and we get this, knight goes to c6, the bishop comes back. Black has an impenetrable position, literally nothing in black's position is weak. So some short while later, the players just shuffled their pieces back and forth for a little while, Literally, this half of this game was just shuffling the rooks, and the game ends in a draw. MVL chooses not to risk anything, not to kind of play. Look at this, literally. I mean, it's like draw. So like I said, it was going to be literally an appetizer. Kind of a interesting queen sacrifice, and the game just ends immediately. Now, a game that did not end immediately was the game Fabiano Caruana versus Jan-Krzysztof Duda. This one was something. So first things first, Fabiano plays e4, and they play a Petrov defense. Up until this moment in the game, where black plays the move c5, Duda is playing black, and Fabiano actually himself played this with black in none other than his match against Magnus Carlsen, November 2018, for the World Championship crown. So this is kind of a funny position because as I tweeted about this game, it's kind of like the scene in The Half-Blood Prince of Harry Potter when Harry launches a spell at, at Snape, and Snape looks at him and says, "You dare use my own spells against me, Potter." Yes, I'm not going to spoil anything else in case you haven't seen Harry Potter, but here Fabiano, in a position that's been reached 70 times, plays rook h to g1, a move that's never been played, which shows you how dangerous it is to play into the preparation of your opponent who has looked at these lines. And now all hell breaks loose. Obviously, the point is to go g4, g5. Black plays b5, white goes g4. So not taking, not indulging into your opponent's attack with queen a5. We get bishop to b7, queen e2, c4 attacking the bishop. The bishop pops out to f5. The bishop actually looks trapped if you play g6. But then white would have played knight to d4, g takes f5, and would have played gf5 with some attack, or even the more aggressive g5, attacking the knight with knight takes, queen coming, and the game is basically lost for black, believe it or not, even though black is up a piece. So, knight to d4, knight to d5, and then Fabiano thought for 40 minutes here and played knight to e6. And this cannot be taken because there is check in this. So, queen a5. Queen to f3, bishop f6, g5. Sacrificing the bishop on c3 is Duda. Not indulging, bishop takes h7 from Fabiano. These boys are hockey fighting. I'm talking grabbing each other by the collar. Bam! Bam! Both sides sacrificing the bishop to open the opponent's king. King takes h7, g6 sacrificing another pawn, activating the rook. Now we get knight comes back to g5. King goes to h8, because if it went to g8, there would have been queen f7. So king to h8, and Fabiano Caruana, oh, fabulous Fabi, bishop d4, the top engine move. The only move that doesn't lose the game, and also gives white a winning advantage. Bishop takes, rook takes. Now the pawns are all calm, rook is coming to h4, but Duda finds the only move, sacrificing his bishop to make sure his knight guards his king. Rook to b8, queen continues to harass. Rook to e1 check, they are playing the top line of the engine this whole time. Rook d1, take. Rook goes to e8. Knight goes to e6, threatening, mate. Duda sacrifices. Queen takes a2. Queen h3, king g8. So what the hell is going on? First, they repeat once. They repeat. Fabiano goes for queen a3. Let's not forget this is the 33rd move of the game. They're both low on time. We get a simplification to an endgame. Material is equal. Rook and 4 versus knight and 6. It's the same. So what happens? King d2, a6. King to e3, knight to d5, king to d4, knight goes back to e7. And in this position, Fabiano Caruana, low time, had to play the move a4. He had to chip away at the structure. Of course, Duda cannot take. It causes him too many pawn weaknesses, and then the rook will come gobble, 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 and Pac-Man, wah, 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 wah. But instead, if he doesn't take on a4, in this position after a4. If he doesn't take on a4, instead something like king e6, we get take, and the rook is coming to b1. If rook b1, knight c6, you have king c3, there's no way to guard this. If you push it, I take. So this was Fabiano's only chance. He waited one move, and that gave black the time to walk his king behind his knight and guard everything. And the rest of this game was Duda just monumental, titanic struggle of defense. But he brings his king, coordinates with his pawns, and the game ends in a repetition because Fabiano cannot make any progress. The threat of knight to d5 is too strong. You cannot lose your pawn here on c3. So we get this, and a repetition of moves. Because by playing king a5, you cannot go knight to d5. Well, I mean, you can, but then I'll just bring my rook back, and there is nothing. I'm never going to be able to push my pawn, defend this, and successfully advance. Who says the draws are boring? Some draws are like the draw we just saw, and some draws are like this. Ugh. But Fabiano had that one chance where he could have played a4, but now we show the two decisive games of the day. First, taking a look, actually no, first this. The game between our leader, Niels Grandelius, and the second highest rated player in all of India, Pensala Harikrishna, with the black pieces. Niels goes e4, we get e6, d4, d5, a French defense, and surprising e5. The advanced variation of the French, not too good, not too frequently seen at the GM level. I'm not saying it's a bad line, I'm just saying black is fine. Normally we see knight c3 or knight d2, classical or tarash. Black plays c5 and brings his queen out, and Pensala plays a really interesting line, bishop to d7, bishop to e2, takes, and solves the problem of his bad bishop. Oftentimes in the French defense, the light-squared bishop gets stuck behind the pawns, so you immediately maneuver it out and trade it off, which looks kind of insane to spend 3 moves doing this, but it's good, because now you've got the open c-file, your knight goes to c6, you move your other knight to e7, and then rotate it out this way. You also play a useful move h6 to prevent your opponent from ever playing the move knight to g5, bishop d2 and knight to g6, h4, bishop b4. So black has concluded all stages of the game. Knight comes out to a4, drops the queen back, not too scary, kicks the knight back. And here, a big decision. What does Niels Grandelius do? Does he take, or does he play bishop to f4? He plays bishop to f4. And this move leaves this bishop here, re-strengthens the center, and white wants to play a3 and b4 and rook to c1 and do this. So black doesn't have a lot of time to wait. So what does black do? Black plays queen a5. Now white reacts with b3, and black plays the move b5, immediately attacking. White retreats, black attacks again. White retreats, black castles. Every move black is making is improving black's position. Niels plays rook b1, enabling the movement of the knight once again. Rook to c7, right? This is where the game is going to be played. On the c-file, you're ready to bring your other rook. Also, rook c7 is just a good flexible waiting move. You're waiting for your opponent to do something. The opponent plays knight d3. The queen slides back. There is a new threat on d4. So b4 is trying to lock this bishop away. Well, black's ready. a5. That's the other idea of queen b6. Notice you cannot push your pawn into where your queen is. So Harikrishna is ready for this. B takes, knight takes. Bishop c1. Niels says, you know what? I regret not trading bishops earlier. So can we have a trade now? Sure, take. But I'm coming. I'm coming with my knight now to c4. You waited too long. Now I'm making progress on that side of the board. This little isolated guy here, this little guy here. What are all these pawns doing, Niels? You've pushed all these pawns to these squares. For what? There's just going to be targets. So now rook comes to a8. Rook c1, knight c6. g3, rook a3. It seems like Pensala Harikrishna, this whole game, played it like it was a symphony. I mean, like, just every piece got involved. King g2, queen slides back to a7. Perfect square. Vision on both pawns. So difficult to defend. And then the knight comes in. And the whole house collapses for Niels Grandelius. Rook c3, knight takes. Rook d3, and then, oh, beautiful simplification technique here. Sacrifices the rook, and knight c1. The knight crosses all the way down to the opponent's side of the board, forks and picks this up, and now the queen slides in. Beautiful game. Harikrishna made his opponent look like he just was outclassed through all stages of the game. The opening, the middle game, and now the conversion into the end game, and the game is over with the B pawn. The pawn, the whole game was decided in this rectangle. Do you realize that? The entire game happened on this side of the board. Nothing happened over here. Literally nothing. There was no king hunt involved. He just beat him on the queen side, beat him in a positional game, won a pawn, and that is how the French defense is truly played. And you know what the best part is? Pensala Harikrishna has a course on beating the French defense. It's called French Toast, I think. My friend has it. He used it to prepare for some tournaments. So shout out to Pensala Harikrishna for a beautiful game. Number 2 player from India. You know, we've got a lot of Indian fans who watch these overnight when I upload in the United States. They wake up and they watch these videos. So, hey, listen, amazing that we have Pensala playing such high-level chess. And we will end with ALIREZA Firouzja versus David Anton. ALIREZA half out of 2 after losing to Magnus. Plays d4, knight f6. This was also the longest game of the round, nearly 6 hours. A London system. Kind of rare to see this. Knight d2, take, and what happens early in this game is the pawn structure is already determined. There is a very quick trade in the center. White does not have an e-pawn, black has no c-pawn. It's kind of like a Caro-Kann. d4, d5, take, exchange variation, queen e2, and Allezreza plays h4. And this game for a long time was a solid game. King f1, to then play rook b1, a queen trade, damaging the structure. Allezreza did this because in the future he's going to plant his king on g2. He's not sure what he wants to do yet with the king. He's able to play a move like this that looks like a mouse slip, because the reality is it's not clear what's going to happen. It's a very solid and close position. Where are the pawn breaks? White can break in the future with c4. Black can break in the future with b6. Where are the critical squares to plant your pieces in games like this? Knight b6, knight a4, knight b6, knight c4. f6, g5, e5 for black, rook to e1 for white, knight g5. Watch as all this gets used. Knight b3, rook e1, king f7, knight c1. Allezreza wants to put the knight on d3, and he does exactly that. Black, meanwhile, maneuvers over here. Bishop to g3, knight a5. Hey, I said that might happen. Knight a5, knight c4. So we get king g1, knight c4, and rook comes to e2. The good thing is that black's pawns are kind of stuck, so black cannot break. With the pawns, black might have to break only in the center. And even that is really hard. So king h2, bishop f8, and rook e1. b6. King g1. I thought here the players were going to repeat. Rook a8, bishop f4. Take my bishop, please, begs Allezreza. No. King g2, just improving his position. Knight comes back to g1. Knight comes out to h3. Bishop e7, knight goes back to g1. Like, dudes, just end the game, make a draw. But Allezreza says, no. My king is going to be useful. He uses his king as the advancement mechanism. What? Like, that's how creative you need to be sometimes. Not worried about even a check because you back up. Pawns don't go backwards, kings go backwards, and now you've created a terrible weakness on e5 with just one pawn move. One pawn move changes the whole game at this level of chess. So we get rook to h8, h5, knight f8, and knight f4. One guy is making progress. He's got a target. You'll notice that, right? The e-file stack. Bishop d8, rook h1, trying to push. The knight comes forward. The knight jumps into g6, knight d7, rook e1, and rook e8. He trades off his passive bishop. The rook, meanwhile, is able to maintain defense of this pawn, while also pressuring this, right? We saw this in HARIKRISHNA's game, where a piece has multiple directions of defense or attack. So, rook d6, king h3, knight f8. Knight g6 trying to extract the defense, knight h7, and he knows the knight is trying to come, so what does he do? He moves the only pawn that hasn't moved yet on the side, f4, clamping down. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things monitoring this e5 square, and whenever you have two rooks like this and there's a piece on the other side that's got no guard sufficient, knight f5 is an idea. And I'd be willing to bet that is constantly on the mind of David Anton, who then backs up and defends his rook. Rook to g1. Allezreza has found a new point of entry. Every castle needs at least 2 entrance points of collapse. Knight d6 back, rook to g2. Rook to g8, and Allezreza Firouzja, in a position where it all looks defended, finds knight to e7. An infiltration spot which has not been accounted for, and if you take my knight, I take your pawn, and I am just in time to check you and win this. If you play knight to f7, thinking this, well, like a bad news, your rook is hanging. So instead, David Anton plays knight to g5, but we take, and the rook jumps in. King slides back to f7. Allezreza, beautiful move, not rushing with rook f1, which is careless. Instead, he plays knight back to f3, redirecting it toward the middle, from where it pressures e6 and the pressure on g7 constant. And ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget that this pawn can still move forward. That's exactly what he does. Knight to the middle, rook takes g7, and it's the pawn. It's the deciding pawn, just like in the HARIKRISHNA game. The b pawn, the h pawn here is the difference. Rook h8, king back to g4. Rook takes h6, sacrificing the pawn for the greater good. Rook to d7. And the game is over. David Anton resigns because if he moves his knight, it's mate. It's mate. So Allezreza found the break-in point down the middle as a way to get the opponent to tie his pieces together. and then infiltrated on the G line using the pawn break with the king. Beautiful game, a long game, a game that feels good to win, a game that took 6 hours nearly to win. And that brings us to the end of this day in Tata Steel. And these are the standings after 3 rounds. Grandelius, Carlsen, Giri, Caruana, HARIKRISHNA with 2 points. A full standings list. Some draws obviously happened today. Donchenko Giri, for example, was a draw. Wojtaszek drew with Jordan Van Forest. MVL Yasipenko was a draw. And we have basically looked at all of the games of day 3. Hope you are, as always, enjoying the recaps. Let me know. I don't know. Whatever. Just let me know what you're up to. I don't know what question to ask. I'm enjoying making these recaps for all of you. Hopefully, you're all enjoying them as well. And I look forward to making more of them.